Good morning.
Good morning.
I am going to consciously and intentionally lead us through this great discussion this morning. We have really great people here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. We're just going to get into it. So I'm going to ask my great panelists, who I will introduce in just a moment, to say what they would like to about their organizations. But we try to put together a group of people who are coming from different experiences and perspectives to talk about racial equity in community economic development from the way that they see it. So I'm going to ask different questions to different people to try to bring out the strengths and really, hopefully, maybe be a little provocative and get a good discussion underway. My name is Ann Pasmanic, and I have worked in community development for a long time. Like a lot of people, I came through a personal experience, which was of being evicted illegally many years ago from a building in Brooklyn, New York, before Brooklyn was really hip. And it was just sort of at the beginning stage of gentrification. And it was very, very hard and aggressive, the sort of the environment for communities, people who had lived in the neighborhood for a long time. People saw dollar signs, and the formula was very simple. Get people out, replace them with new people with more money, and there's all sorts of implications to that. And that's what sort of started my own journey. So we all come from different, probably variations of that theme. And I'm very happy to have such a great group of people on this panel. So first, we have Ron Hance from Network for Developing Conscious Communities. Our leader in this whole, he doesn't like that, but our leader in this whole discussion. We also have Lydia Walker Rodriguez from CASA, and those of you from Baltimore and from Maryland overall know the power of CASA in moving both political change and community change, so we're very happy to have her. Jeremy Greer has started an organization, so this is very exciting. He's been in the community development and political and movement building field for a long time, but now he's doing it through his own lens. And this organization is called Liberation in a Generation. So let that sink in, and he's going to explain what that means, but that's very exciting. Seema Adnani is the leader of National Capacity, and she leads networks across the nation of Asian American Pacific Islander organizations and people. So they are each bringing great experience, and she's been a community organizer in Queens. Enough said, that's a lot of people power that she has developed over time. So that's my introduction. Inadequate, but it's going to do for now. And I am going to take myself, I think, back here so I can be a little closer to the group. But I'm going to start off with a question, and that question is going to go to Ron. And Ron, the question is, can you start us off by talking about your perspective on the state of racial equity in the community development nonprofit sector now? What does it look like? What is the state of play? What is the world that we are working on to vastly improve? Oh, you can just. That's right.
This one. Very important question, man. We're not where we were, or we're not where we need to be. This question of wealth, which I raised earlier, is the question of the time. How we build wealth in a society where 1% of the population has control of 99% of the wealth. Where many neighborhoods that were considered the worst neighborhoods are now being gentrified, and people are being economically displaced. I think we all want to see thriving, growing neighborhoods. But what we don't want to see is those long-term residents being displaced out of their neighborhoods. We see the displacement of culture. When you take uproot people, you uproot culture. I want to just think about the policy that we have in this country. And probably some of the work that we all are doing in terms of our work. This community development sector has gone and created almost like a nonprofit industrial complex, where it's not serving the people and organizations that it was intended to serve. You know, the CBC industry, actually formerly out of New York, under Robert Kennedy, and Best Buy. And it was originated to help neighbors and residents create better communities. When I was in Pittsburgh earlier this year, I learned that Pittsburgh, the network was started by a local organizer, a black woman who wanted to make change in her neighborhood. Well, if you look at the organization today, you would never see that in its lens. So there's a lot of work to do. But as Reverend has said, it all begins with us. And how are we practicing ourselves racial equity in our organizations? And I'm not talking about racial equality, because they're two different conversations. See, equity means that you got to give up something, that you can't hoard it all by yourself, that you got to share. See, racial equality means I can be at the table and have no stake while at the table. So certainly this paradigm shift has to take place. Because when we look around and see the violence in this country, I always think about the lack of opportunities that people are being afforded. 2015 in Baltimore, it was an uprising. And in that community, nothing has changed. Tony Presley, who's straight ahead of me, doing work in a community called Druid Heights in West Baltimore. The life expectancy in his community is 63 years. But if you go 14 miles north of his community, in the right community of Roland Park, the life expectancy is 83 years. Something's wrong with that. That your zip code can determine your life expectancy. So, with that question, and that's the work that's before us. Thank you.
Jeremy, I'm going to turn to you, literally. And Ronnie's talked about sort of the state of things. And we know that this world that we're in, that we try to do well in, has limitations. And I want to know how you think about that. What is your framework for thinking and talking about and working on now for liberation in a generation, racial equity and racial inequity? Do you think about this as an economic condition? Do you think about it politically? What is your framework?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me in the back? All of you hear me? All right. So I'll just start with liberation and generation. So I was previously with Prosperity Now and with Santi Muhammad, who's now at NCRC, you're going to hear from later. We started what's called the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, and we together put forth some work. Some of the data that's used today to talk about the racial wealth divide came from that work. But since then, I've branched off to start Liberation and Generation, which was really what we hope to do is take that work to the next phase. So how do we create policy solutions that are going to change the systems so that people are economically liberated from oppression and economic oppression? And you're going to understand why I'm using that language in a moment. You talked about frames. I love that we're here to talk about solutions and that no one here is coming with a solution, because I can tell you I don't have them. I have some ideas, but I don't have them. But what I can do is diagnose the problem that we're seeing. And what we we have to do is understand. So I've been operating in my career for a long time, feeling kind of like Neo in the Matrix. Right? I have a worldview of how I believe things are working because of the external reinforcement that I get. And I came to an understanding that it isn't working the way that I thought it was supposed to work. And a lot of the way that I did my work, which I thought was racial justice work, which I thought was economic justice work, was work that was being informed by a worldview that was ultimately going to lead to solutions that failed. And the reason why that is because it ignores some fundamental truths. But first, what is that worldview? Right? That worldview we've been given is that, like, person is born at disadvantage. Right? Some circumstances. You insert opportunity, then they become prosperous. Like, that's the worldview we're given. No racial diagnosis in that. No explanation for why they're disadvantaged. And the awakening for me was coming to one fundamental truth, that you have to start with racism. And not just racism as a thing that happens between two people, but racism as a system that works. And understanding that racism is profitable. It is a profitable endeavor. Racism is used by the elite, as Ron talked about, to bring profit. It's why you can pay someone less than their worth. It's why you can tell them they can't purchase a house in one neighborhood, but they can purchase a house in another neighborhood that's of less value. It is why you can walk into a community, look through a window, and shoot a woman dead in her own house. It is what is they allowed to do so that we can be economically oppressed and operate in an oppression economy where racism is profitable so that they can suppress our economic vitality, which leads to the suppression of our political power, which means we can then not fully participate in a democracy that will create the change that we need. That is the worldview in the framework that I understand it to be now. Well, why is that important? It's important because if you understand it in that way, you realize that you have to intervene in a different place. Before we intervene with the person, I'm going to provide this person a social service, or I'm going to provide this person this program or that program. And we might help some people that way. We have helped people that way. But if you understand the framework in the way that I do, racism leads to economic oppression, leads to political suppression, then leads to our inability to participate in democracy, you understand you have to intervene at the political place. Because this is a political problem. These systems are created through our political process. These systems that oppress our people are run by our government. And the way that you can intervene in that is through our politics. So I don't have all the solutions, but one thing I know is the way that we as nonprofits keep saying, well, we don't get political, means that we're not playing the game where we need to be playing. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation. I'll leave it there, but that's where I think we stand.
Powerful. And so we have gone through the state of where we are and sort of where that,
We've gone through the state of where we are and what impact that has on communities. The racist policymaking, intentional racist policymaking that created that situation that we are now finding new ways to deal with now. I'm going to turn to Lydia. And Lydia is at CASA. CASA is both a 501c3 and a 501c4, which she will clarify for us, the implications of that. So we all have different perches through which we try to be effective in this environment. And I'm interested to know, and I think people will be interested to hear, how CASA builds what Ron talked about, which is intentionality and consciousness, into its organizational infrastructure. Because sometimes we think in the nonprofit world, it's all, we know everything and we're just going out there and telling people what to do and how to do things. It really starts with some consciousness and intentionality about our own organization. Some organizations are willing and able to do that, others not so much. So, Lydia, how does that work within CASA, and how are you changing the way that you operate internally to make an impact externally?
Absolutely, thank you so much. So to talk through that, I want to talk a little bit about the history of CASA and how we've evolved and changed since we started. We started in the 1980s in the basement of a church. And CASA used to be an acronym, American Solidarity Association. And the reason we were founded in the 80s was because there was a lot of our Central American community that was fleeing the civil wars in Central America and was immigrating here to Maryland, but there was no support for our community once they reached here. So the founding of our organization, we were only doing direct services. We were supporting folks with English classes, with citizenship classes. We were supporting folks with raid responses in case there was ICE raids in the community. But we very quickly realized that we were just putting a Band-Aid on the systemic issue that we were facing as immigrant communities here in the state of Maryland, right? With direct services, all we could do was work case by case by case, but we weren't able to break through that glass ceiling of oppression that our community was facing here in Maryland. So after we formed our C3 in the late 90s, we actually started a sister organization called CASA in Action, and that's our 501c4. And we realized that we had to arm ourselves in a political way. We had to start to fight legislation that continued to oppress our people. We had to gain political power and start endorsing candidates that had a platform that supported immigrant community members so that we can start to fight the system rather than to just fight the outcome and support people with direct services. And so once we started to shift this mentality, we didn't lose ourselves from our original foundation of our organization. Because when we were doing direct services, we realized that we were ensuring that we were able to implement a victory. Because what happens? Example, when we started our CASA in Action, right, we would win certain legislations, like we won the Maryland Dream Act here in Maryland in 2012, right? We won the ability to get a driver's license regardless of your immigration status here in the state of Maryland in 2012. And after winning those victories, we needed to continue to do the direct service to ensure that we didn't lose through implementation. Because what happens? Yes, we won the victory of the driver's license here in the state of Maryland, but in order to get a driver's license, if you're undocumented in the state of Maryland, you have to show that you have been able to pay taxes for the last 2 years. Right? You have to, what did the NBA do? They made the system all in English, and you have to do 5 steps instead of the 2 steps that everybody else takes to get a driver's license. Right? So what started to happen? Fraud started happening in our community. A lot of pop-up shops started happening. They were charging $1,500 to apply for an ITIN number. Because regardless of your immigration status, you can file a 1040, right? You can do your taxes, you just have to apply for an ITIN number. Folks started charging immigrant community members $1,500 to do a form that takes about 15 minutes to do. They started charging $350 to go into the MBA appointment and make an appointment for you. On top of you having to pay taxes for 2 years. So we're talking about a driver's license that an individual was paying maybe $10K plus. And so we realized that we couldn't stop doing direct services because if we won a victory, we would lose through implementation because we weren't able to serve our people. So we expanded our direct services in addition to adding our political arm, and we do taxes for free at CASA. Everybody can come and do their taxes with us if you make under $54,000, right? We started doing ITIN applications for free. We started doing MBA appointments for free. Because it's one thing to win a victory, but it's another to actually be able to win it through implementation. So both of our organizations work together to continue to break through that glass ceiling, right? And so when we first started, we started with direct services, and we continued direct service arm. Then with CASA in Action, we added the advocacy and the political endorsement power. But our principal goal at CASA is community organizing and community development. Because we are the largest immigrant rights organization in the Mid-Atlantic that's member-led. And when I say member-led, we're a little bit over 100,000 members. We expanded from Maryland to opening up an office in Virginia to recently opening up an office in Pennsylvania. And when I say member-led, our members are directly impacted immigrant community members who lead our movement and lead our decision-making. And when I say community organizing is at the forefront of all the work we do, we invest in community organizing, and we have leadership committees that are geographically based in anywhere that we work. And those committees consist of 30 to 100 immigrant community members, and we ensure that they are making the decisions of how we use our resources, operate, and invest in what fights we continue to fight in the movement. And from those leadership committees, our immigrant community members are actually part of our board that make those decisions. You'll meet maybe 2 of our board members tomorrow, which are 19, 20 years old. And our Casa in Action board actually writes up the interview questions that they utilize to interview candidates who are running for office. From city council members to governors. They just finished doing a candidate form for folks who are running for president. And it's amazing to watch. We had 13 candidates who were running for governor, and it was amazing to watch our 25 board members, who are all our members, interviewing each candidate and watching each candidate so nervous as they answer the questions, right? And most of them were between 19 years old. That's who we endorse. And our endorsement just doesn't come with saying Casa in Action endorses you, right? But those same community members canvass. Last year we knocked 13,900 doors for a pro-immigrant candidate who was running against someone who was going for re-election and was anti-immigrant in Anne Arundel County. We won with less than 4% that election. And after we won, that pro-immigrant candidate eliminated 287G in Anne Arundel, which allows the police officers to collaborate with ICE, and also closed down the detention center in Anne Arundel County.
Wow.
And that was thanks to the leadership of our members endorsing this candidate, but then implementing the work and knocking doors. And so many people say immigrant community members can't vote. Well, guess what? We changed that election. And we are at a time where we're getting these threats from the current administration, and many say that we're paralyzed. But right now we're gearing our strategy and fighting on the state level and local level to ensure we survive to the next administration. Thank you.
So, we're hearing about racial equity, building community power, taking the term community engagement and really making it real, because that's real, the degree and the depth to which the community is engaged. I'm going to ask Seema, who knows something about this, because as a national Asian American Pacific Islander organization, you are working with how many members? About 100 member organizations throughout the country. All different types, different communities, different issues around community development and more broadly social, whatever that means, and racial justice. So I'm going to ask you how you approach this question of racial equity in this sector where people are trying to do very practical things, provide services, and help people in the day-to-day to have better lives and better opportunities. And then how are you working on that broader picture so that their future is good and they are a part of the political process, the decision-making process in their communities?
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you so much, Ron, for inviting me back. And my condolences to the Baltimore community for your recent losses. That was Representative Cummings, that, he was a voice from all of our communities and a really powerful advocate, so we're all going to feel that for a while. So So national capacity, we are a coalition, and we were formed as a coalition. About 5 organizations around the country working in low-income Asian American Pacific Islander communities came together to form this organization. So our roots are really from local organizations, and we've really built out our organizational structure to hold true to that. So we are very much committed to growing resources and support for the local organizations, and then trying to build a national voice for our community on the national level. Just to take a step back to the level of conversation we were at, I think for national capacity and for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community more broadly, a lot of racial economic justice really is rooted in land rights. We serve a very diverse population of Asian American, my family is South Asian, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and so the issue of who has right to the land and who controls the land is really at our core. Many of our communities also were very much impacted by colonialization, and my own family, for example, was displaced from its, where our family was for generations because of the war between India and Pakistan that was, essentially rooted in the British when they left India. And so we have a long history of displacement. The Native Hawaiians are still fighting that fight today for their land. And so the way we are approaching the community development work is very much to tie it to this community organizing approach. A lot of our founding organizations were more traditional CDCs, did sort of the brick and mortar development work. But their roots are in community organizing. If you look at one organization, for example, where I worked in New York City, Asian Americans for Equality, it is a very large developer in New York City now today, and they are doing really important work of developing and preserving affordable housing. However, their original roots were around a development that came up in Chinatown, and they were organizing for jobs in that development. And eventually, when the low-income housing tax credit was put in place, they did one of the first developments in the country of affordable housing using that low-income housing tax credit. And so, what started out as community organizing eventually became institutionalized in order to develop affordable housing in what is now Chinatown, Loisaga, and they now own thousands of units. So that's the story of many of our founding CDCs, and eventually, we decided to expand the coalition to a much broader base that included a more diverse base of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So we as a community have the highest income inequality within our community than any other group, right? So we do have extreme wealth in this country as well that are Asian American. We also have extreme poverty. We are also the fastest growing poverty population in the U.S. today. And so what we are dealing with in terms of racial equity is, you will hear a lot of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders talk about data disaggregation. Why is this important? Because when you group our community together, it looks like we're doing well. But that is not what our members and our groups are seeing on the ground. We are serving very low-income populations who often live alongside other communities of color. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of our member organizations around the country that are bringing community organizing back into the development approach are really partnering with other communities of color. This issue of gentrification and displacement is really the major issue our community is facing as well, because we are located in the high-cost cities, right? And so what we are seeing is that the most effective organizations are those that are, to your point, able to provide the services, able to do the development in some cases, although I don't think development is necessary, but really the organizing and political power building, right? Where some of our members in New York, for example, were able to fight off Amazon, you know? And how does a small grassroots organization do that? It's by doing that base building, by coordinating across coalition. And, you know, that story is still going on and we don't know how it's going to end. But I think the only way they were able to fight that was through a multiracial coalition that was really able to come together around who has right to that land.
You know, one thing that strikes me is how fascinating these stories are and these strategies and the work that goes into building them out and implementing them. And yet we don't hear about this enough in the news cycle. And yes, there's a lot of issues to cover right now. I will grant them that. But there is also a powerful tide within communities that is creating the change that we need to see. It's not coming from above. So I want to ask now about some of those upcoming issues in the communities. I'm going to ask you all in a minute the same, which is how are you engaging in sort of the two biggest, maybe organizing challenges of the coming months, and that is, I would say, the 2020 census, where there is both federal resources and political representation up for grabs. It can be gained or it can be lost. And where and how are you involved in the 2020 elections? I don't think you need any explanation from me about why that is crucial. So we've already talked about the real challenge of meeting everyday community needs with building power, with building consciousness, with approaching your own organization internally with intention, with finding new ways to create power and to build capacity in communities. So I'm going to now start with you, Seema, and ask you, are those two issues that your organizations and you as National Capacities Leader are thinking about, and what is your thought about how to be most effective in that great opportunity and challenge before us?
Yeah, I mean, definitely thinking about it, you know, I think, you know, there is another national API organization doing some of that work, so we're not doing all of it. But really, our strategy is to build local capacity. I think, you know, as a national organization, the best thing we could do is provide the resources, do some of the translation work that's needed, and really make sure local communities have what they need to do the work that they need to do. I think from the perspective of the census, we can help make the connections of how the census will impact our communities. You know, thankfully the citizenship question is not on the census. Yeah. But even having that as a possibility from the beginning is going to have a huge impact on whether people trust it enough to participate, you know, so the challenges are great. Yes. And so I want to hear more about what kind of political power we need to build from my fellow panelists, because I do think this is a really important year coming up and we need to be ready. You know?
We do. Jeremy, I know you have an opinion about this.
I do. So on the election, so there was a moment in 2016 that really sticks with me. And there was a moment where Hillary Clinton was out on the campaign trail and she had gotten Black Lives Matter. So on the election, so there was a moment in 2016 that really sticks with me. And there was a moment where Hillary Clinton was out on the campaign trail and she had gotten a Black Lives Matter organizer, had gotten an audience with her backstage on camera in a very intimate setting. Now, this is very rare for you. You don't see this very often where it's like someone's unprompted able to ask a presidential candidate questions. with a camera on. And so this organizer did an incredible thing to get this audience. And the conversation was about the crime bill and like her husband's position on the crime bill and how we had just all that we were seeing at that time. Baltimore was blowing up, Ferguson, all this is happening. And she said, your husband is responsible for these things. And what are you gonna do about this? How do you feel? How is your heart the same? Is what he was asking. And she said, no, you don't care about my heart. You want to know what I'm going to do when I'm president. What are the policies that I'm going to enact? And they're both like talking past each other, right? There's this moment they're just talking past each other. And then the media got a hold of it and they did their thing with it. I did not see, again, that is a failure of that organizer. That organizer got the audience in a very rare space with the presidential candidate. The failure was on us as a field not to arm that organizer with a set of policies that he could say, okay, Hillary Clinton, this is how you can do better. And that is the work that we're trying to do at Liberation Generation. We want to create a policy platform that is not like tinkering around the edges stuff. Give us a few more $1 million to build a couple more houses. What is the bold transformational policies that will change the way our economy treats people of color? To move from an oppression economy to a liberation economy. And what does that policy platform look like? So that when we have that audience again, we can say, here's what it is. The key is what we don't want to do is build that from the top down. Right? I've worked in national think tanks and been on the bad end of taking a policy to community organizers and say, hey, take this policy that we developed and cooked up, here's our white paper, now go. We need to build that platform from the ground up. And think about a vision of an economy that we have never seen before. What would it mean for everyone to have enough income to pay all of their bills and have a little left over? What would it look like for someone to be able to afford their housing in any community that they want to live in? Or be able to purchase a home if they want to? What does it look like to feel like when I go to work, I'm bringing value? They value me, I value this. It's a reciprocal relationship. And what does an economy look like where we belong? No matter who you are. If you're an immigrant, Central American immigrant that just came here because you're fleeing violence in your own country, you belong. Whether you're formerly incarcerated, you're just getting out of prison because you made a mistake in your life and you paid your penance and now you're coming back. What does that look like to be a part of the economy? That is what we have to create together so that next set of candidates, we can tell them what is needed and what they can do for us.
Lydia, I know, before I even ask, that the census and the 2020 elections are very important and that CASA has a plan. I don't think you've waited to put together that plan. And I just want to remind us all that the President of the United States and the Secretary of Commerce saw an opportunity through the census to dilute the power of communities and people of color and set out to win and lost that effort to impose a question about citizenship status on the 2020 census. So, yay for the loss, but damage has been done. And what it means is that we know that historically, even the Census Bureau knows and has studied that there are communities that have been undercounted. Communities of color, children under 5, LGBTQ families. So this has serious implications, and damage has been done just to instill the fear of a citizenship question. So Lydia, I'm going to ask what your approach at CASA is to these two sort of important moments. And again, we're talking about this because we are trying to find new ways to make racial equity more than something that we talk about at conferences, but that is in real everyday life, and we know and have an idea of how to really operationalize it.
Thank you. And I'll start with the election question and go back to the census question. And just even reflecting just now on the morning after the November elections 3.5 years ago, right? I remember that morning because I remember one of our members called me and said, you know, I haven't slept all night, and I want you to know that I'm ready for tomorrow. Let's take today off, and I'm ready for tomorrow. And hearing that and knowing that so many members were so afraid and are constantly still living in fear has struck us. But so many of our members have not allowed that fear to isolate them and have really been the motivation that has continued our organization. These last 3.5 years have been the hardest to organize. They've been the toughest on our community and all communities of color. And we've seen an uptake of this administration targeting cities and targeting municipalities that are supporting immigrant community members by trying to expand programs like 287G and ensuring police officers are working with ICE or limiting funds if they don't, right? So we realized that we needed to take a different approach, and our members were really the motivating factors in it. And they said, let's fight on the state level. Let's fight on the local level. Because before this administration, we were on the offense. We were pushing for new legislation, and we were winning new things, and we were getting new services as a result. But now, these last 3.5 years, we've been on defense. We've been thinking of ways how we survive this administration for the next administration. So we've really been battling, as I mentioned before, on the state level, and using that political power to ensure candidates are including pro-immigrant platforms and fighting for our communities by us pressuring them. Either they're with us or we're organized to get them out of office. And so we've been doing that at the state level and doing that at the local level. And through this, time of uncertainty, we were hit again with the administration canceling the DACA program, canceling TPS for so many. And so many community members that had work permits that were the drivers and the members who were coming out of the shadows in a little bit, more valiant way because they were not afraid, were now being hit with. There was a dreamer that has been with us for the past 6 years who was 15 days away from closing on her first house. And when they announced the cancellation of DACA, the bank took the loan. And now the Supreme Court's hearing oral arguments on DACA on the 12th of November. And so many community members stepped back from the movement, but so many new community members stepped forward and came out of the shadows. And as we continue to fight, they have been really instrumental, and they have really been the ones making the decisions of how we move, right? And so we've won so many state and local victories, which have allowed less ICE raids, because we're more protected on the state level, and we're more protected on the city level. We continue to fight in that way. And I wanted to share that with you first, because in a committee meeting we had maybe about a year ago when we heard about the census question, community members stepped up and said, we need to do something. We can't just allow this question to be on the census, because this is a direct attack to our community to make us so scared and so paralyzed that we don't respond to the census. Because the census controls how many delegates there are in the House, and how many delegates there are in the House controls the Electoral College, and essentially controls the election, in addition to so many services that we need. So many community members stepped up, and so we had a gathering of all of our leaders all throughout all 3 states. And they said, let's sue the administration. Let's sue the Census Bureau. And we sued the Census Bureau. GASA, along with 2 other partners, sued the Census Bureau, sued the administration. The litigation went all the way to the Supreme Court, and guess what? We won. And that citizenship question is not on the census, not because they decided that it wasn't fair, but because they heard the fight, and they heard members saying we weren't going to give up, right? And so as this litigation was happening, we said we needed to continue to build on organizing and leadership development. So many community members filled up buses from all over Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and went to the Supreme Court to continue to raise awareness of the injustice of this question even being on the forum. And those very same members are members that we're going to be hiring to do a canvass for the census to ensure that everybody gets counted. And we are partnering that canvass with a Know Your Rights to ensure everybody knows their rights as well.
Ron, what do you see as the opportunity in the 2020 census and the 2020
elections for strengthening coalition work, for strengthening engagement across organizations of color, for strengthening racial equity work overall? Or do you see that?
Well, let me see if I can approach your question from a different posture. What we're seeing in this country is not new. After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, his Vice President Johnson took helm as president. And what he began to do was turn back all the work that Lincoln had worked on previously, in terms of giving opportunities to the enslaved to vote, working on the thought of the 40 acres and the mule. Those policies were turned around because Johnson allowed those Southern politicals who were against the Union to come back into the Union. And as they came back into the Union, the suppression of black voters began to take place through violent means. The eruption and the organizing of the KKK. Union troops were pulled out of the South. And so you had, at that time, 4 southern states that had black leadership. Black leadership that grew out of enslaved people. Those states turned southern and turned to white leadership. So one of the things that I think about, particularly around the question of voting, I think even in terms of the impact of gentrification and how it's moving people around communities. And those strong voting blocks that we once had are now being diluted. So let's not be fooled to think that the ramifications of gentrification doesn't have long-term implications for many communities. Because it's moving numbers, it's moving people. But then I look out to you, and as I asked before, what content are you bringing to yourselves in terms of work that you're doing within your organizations? One of the things that happened politically in Ferguson, that Germany had mentioned, that the community in Ferguson, Missouri, did several things. They went back and looked at an equity framework in Ferguson. But one of the things they did that I thought was very critical, they mandated that every politician would have an equity agenda attached to their political platform. And if they didn't, that politician was not going to receive the votes and support of the community. Because they understood the long-term effects of inequities in that city and what it meant in terms of citizen participation. So that's one thing. But the other thing is leadership. Now, we have to, my colleagues have talked a lot about organizing. We can't get around a couple of things. One, we have to be able to do research, folks. You can't be low on your content. You have to be students in this work that you're doing. So when someone asks you a question, you can't respond, well, I didn't know that. Because if you didn't know that, then go learn that. Continue to be read and versed with knowledge. Secondly, we have to drive this whole question of what Jeremy mentioned and Lydia mentioned, and Stephen, powerful. We have to be engaged in creating new policy. Thirdly, none of this work goes without advocacy. Now, you may be a 501c3 and certainly you're prohibited from participating politically to some degree, but you're not prohibited from being advocates. And so as you convene your community, you got to educate your community. I know that, from firsthand, Tony Presley, who's been executive director of Drew Heights, they do a good job of that, and preparing their community to be advocates. Because no one advocates better for you than you. So there are a couple things that we should learn out of the 60s when Dr. King was assassinated around investing all the knowledge in a few. One of the things that this organization, and I don't do all the work that my colleagues do, but one of the things that I advocate, and we advocate, when people come to our events, bring somebody. Don't allow yourself to be inequitable around your practices of just wanting to be the only person who knows everything. That should be a part of your spiritual and humanistic toolkit. That I'm going to take the responsibility for bringing someone along and educate them along the way. So, I think your last question was about voting. I addressed that. And the census. We have to mobilize. We got to take some lessons out of the 60s, folks. The civil rights movement embedded in our parents and our grandparents, for many of the young ones, and use them. We got to use them. All of them weren't bad tools, and they weren't bad lessons. But we can't keep being ignorant and acting ignorant to what we say we don't know. It's no longer an excuse, as I see it. This information that we get now is readily accessible in so many ways. So with that, I hope that this new election that we're going into, that we really see the gravity. It's not about personality, and that was one of the things that upset me about 2016. People voted out of their own best interest. And now, after 3 years, we see what that interest has brought us. A lot of division, a lot of pain, a lot of hate. So those are my thoughts.